This is a production of Cornell University.
Okay, so with that, just a couple of words about taking care of yourself. The National Association of Landscape Professionals on Twitter, on the web, addressing the issues, right? Everybody's short-staffed, everybody's running around. It's a normal spring, plus there's a lot of concern about our health and safety and those of our loved ones, right? So that's feels like burning the candle at both ends to me. So I think anything we can do to support ourselves, our mental health as well as our physical health. And mental health often gets neglected, but of course, incredibly important. And we hope that the 30 minutes we've been able to do the last couple of months have been a part of whatever's been helping you get through what we're going through. So let's do a little weather. We remain well behind, right? I mean, this is where Utah is, right, Paige, up at 4,000 feet. It's still pretty cold up there. So for us, it's really well behind normal, and this is entirely unexpected by the middle of May. I mean, we were on pace early on in late March and early April to see the growing season advance significantly. But have not been able to really see it advance much. In fact, we're only expected to be normal. If you look at the amount of heat we're going to accumulate, obviously you see we're well into the double digits now, 50 to 70 growing degree days, penetrating well into upstate New York. But look at much of northern New England, the northeast, the eastern end of Long Island. You can see still not much accumulation. It will be normal. Our climate condition, our weather forecasts are calling for normal. And remember, last week it was 20 to 25 degrees below normal for this time of year. I was talking about snow we had on Wednesday. Now, we'll start our conversation with Paige. I'm not going to get into much else beyond the conversation with this scholar about the topics that she's working on. And this is where to start, right? A lot of things that are happening in the soil. You could see a month ago, we were looking really, progressing really far. We were getting into the mid 50s, low to mid 50s. And if you look at more localized soil temperatures in the urban areas in Southeast New York, you'll certainly see a lot warmer temperatures than this data will present. But, you know, in early April, it looked like, okay, we're moving on. And then May, you can see it took us a whole month to just get 10 more degrees. And now you can see we're tracking air temperature to a certain extent and still right in the low 50s. Now we're expecting a big surge of warmth and rain coming through that we'll see some big push in moisture and in soil temperature. And of course, Paige and her colleagues, this is like a who's who with Dan Potter on their page. That was that had to be quite a thing to get Dan working on this. Published last year in Pest Management Science. I believe this was Pest Management Science. Was it Paige?
Yes.
Okay, and in this article, it's just a wonderful review article of the ecology, you know, how these things behave, you know, what are we talking about? It's not one earthworm. They behave different ways, and epigeic, endogeic, aneic, forget it, Paige. I've become a worm scholar just preparing for this thing. As Carl mentioned, the real thing that, listen, this has been a nuisance. I would characterize this as a nuisance, something that we've had a lot of different ways of dealing with this sort of class of pests called worms, right? We call them earthworms, but there's a whole bunch of them. But this is the one now that in the beds that it's in and in the lawns that it's penetrating into is starting to be a problem. So let's chat for, you know, let's see if we can do about 10 minutes, 15 minutes on this. And I want to do about 10, 15 minutes on the clover. So I'll try to keep an eye on the watch because we can go deep, so to speak, on worms. Let's start with this, Paige. You know, one of the things we hear a lot are earthworms a sign of a good soil? Are they a sign of a good soil?
Yeah, so there's kind of conflicting information on this. Some people say that earthworms are a sign of good soil and that because they're there, that's what makes the soil good. Other people, you might hear them say that earthworms are there because the soil is poor, and so they're trying to help it get to a better state. But really, I think worms are pretty prolific everywhere at this point. So I wouldn't take earthworms being in the soil as kind of an end-all be-all for saying, yes, I have good soil.
Okay.
So there's a lot that goes into it.
That's right. Because, you know, you hear, oh, wow, I got worms. This is a good thing, especially in home lawns, right? Especially in home lawns. Now, I mentioned the Asian jumping worm. You talk about many species. Is it one of the things we're used to here in the Northeast with regard to soil insects, so to speak, or soil animals, if you will, is that white grubs, especially in the metropolitan New York area, really up into Rochester and all the major cities, have more than one white grub species. As you go west, the scarab beetle population is mostly Jap beetles or June beetles, and then you come this way, we have 5 different kinds, right? Is that the same thing when it comes to worms, and does that make it sort of difficult to manage them?
Yeah, that's one of the big issues right now with especially golf courses, but kind of moving into lawns, that it's very rare to just have a single species in a soil. Normally there's probably on average at least maybe 3 or 4 species in one given area. And because they all behave differently, there are species differences. And so some of them might burrow, some of them may be kind of top dwellers, those epigeics. And so that makes it really difficult to control these if you are finding them to be a nuisance, because some of them might be able to escape some of the products you're putting down or burrow down deep in the soil to avoid environmental conditions that aren't favorable. And they can enter into a diapause, kind of a hibernation state. So it does make things really, really difficult, especially if you do have a mix, which most places probably do.
And so you have this myriad of behavior. We're seeing this one species, this Asian jumping worm species now. Kyle Wickings, Professor Wickings, our soil insect ecologist, has looked at some simple work of, you know, mulch in a bed in a lawn. You know, will there be a feeding preference for the way they move? You know, that's one that we're wondering about control. But what about food source? Let's talk about food. I mean, it seems like, okay, they've ravaged everything in the bed, and now they're heading to the lawn just because it's there, not because they necessarily prefer it. So let's talk a little bit about, is there a realistic way to manage where these worms are from a food source perspective in the lawn landscape?
Not really. Not that I've seen anyway. Most of the research has been done on golf courses, and so that's kind of the background I'm coming from. And a lot of people thought originally that if you removed clippings, you're removing the organic matter source there, so they might move elsewhere to get food. But that doesn't really seem to be the case. The research doesn't really back that up, and we think that even if you do remove the organic matter or lower the organic matter through all these different management practices, the earthworms are going to stay there. They can't move that much. So they're going to potentially be eating more because they still need to get that organic matter. They still need to get that food. So they have to eat more material in order to get the same amount of nutrients, the same amount of food, which means they're going to be casting more and all of this.
So what about this one worm dominating? I mean, I think the big concern is, okay, I get it. There's lots of worms, and now we got this one guy just doesn't want to play nice with anybody else, seems to dominate these systems. So I'm wondering, what you feel about these things becoming quote unquote, not legal invasive, but behaving as with invasive properties.
Yeah, I mean, most earthworms in the U.S. right now are non-natives. We do have a couple that are on each coast, but most of the ones that we think of when we think of an earthworm are Asian or European species. And so they are going to have kind of those aggressive tendencies because earthworms aren't native to the U.S. in most cases. And so that's kind of another issue that we're facing. But I think because
inherently that means when you say it like that, it means, okay, wait, that means there isn't any natural predators or things that we can rely on to keep these populations in check. Yes.
Yeah, in my review, we talk a little bit about biological control, and again, that was coming more at kind of a golf course standpoint where, you know, you don't want to have a bunch of birds digging up your greens. You don't want to have a bunch of moles digging up your greens. In a home lawn, that might be a little more feasible. There just isn't research on it. We don't know, for as much as we know about everything in turf right now in the soil, like earthworms have not been researched very heavily. And
No,
so it's just really
because
hard.
right, and in your article, and listen, I've been around long enough. We were using mercury. I mean,
Yep.
the guys that I was working with were spraying lead arsenate and
Yep.
chlordane. And when you put that stuff down, you don't have to worry for, I don't know,
You
a
get
decade,
10, 20 years of
Yeah,
control.
right, until you bury it. And what
Yeah.
happened is over time, listen, historically, St. Andrews, I've seen pictures. I tried to pull up pictures, see if I could get some really gross ones of old guys. I saw the late Jim Beard give a talk at an international conference in the 90s where he talked about this worm issue. I mean, it literally almost destroyed the golf business in St. Andrews. I mean, the worms were so prolific because of the compost they were adding and all this other stuff. Now, historically, that's what we did. We got away with it for a little while. Now we see a big resurgence of installing compost back into lawns. Is that literally seeding our lawns with worms? You're smirking.
It could be. I mean, so one of the ways that we think earthworms are kind of getting around is either through compost. There's a lot of people doing vermicomposting right now. So if you have those cocoons or those worms, they can enter your lawn that way. A lot of people will just dump their fishing bait when they're done with
Love
it.
those guys.
And yeah,
Love those
and that
guys.
can cause issues.
Thanks for that.
Mulch can also be a source of cocoons and potentially live earthworms. And then, of course, just human transport. If you know you get a cocoon stuck to your shoe or something, and earthworms, in most cases, are hermaphrodites, and some of them are parthenogenic, so they can reproduce without a mate. And so you get one cocoon in there that can hatch, you know, a couple worms maybe potentially, and the population can kind of explode very quickly.
Okay, so let's wrap this little part up here before we talk about Clover and ask about control. You know, Dan's work with the saponified materials, right, really changed the game. You know, Williamson back in the day when he left Dan, he was studying blackjack stuff, the fly ash, all types of irritants like the deep sand top dressing in the Pacific Northwest. But the easy go-to in the lawn is an insecticide. Well, maybe I can suppress them with this, or worse sorts of things. Is it reasonable to think in a lawn situation, you're going to get control in these soil-based systems easily?
No.
No.
That's the big issue that we talk about with this, is that even if you're controlling the earthworms that are alive and burrowing and all of that right now, those cocoons are really impervious and selectively. So those products are not going to get in those cocoons. They are resistant to heat and desiccation and all of that. So even if you control the population that's currently active, you're not going to get long-term control, because once conditions are favorable again, those cocoons are going to hatch. And if you have earthworms that have burrowed down deep into the soil, those controls in most cases aren't going to reach those worms, so they can just move back up. So it is going to take repeated, very consistent control measures, which in a lot of cases is not feasible either economically or, you know, logistically in lawns. So it's
and so raise the height of cut. Hope the jumping worms don't turn the soil into ball bearings.
Yep.
That the mower sinks. I have to get a picture. My wife maintains a property by the lake that has the worms that have made it out into the lawn, and it's quite a sight. You know, I've never seen it to be that bad, and this thing seems resistant to everything. Because it's living in the bed and the lawn. I think just in the lawn, we might be able to get away with it because, you know, height of cut and maybe the soil won't be so devastated. But the landscape beds are horrific, Paige. I mean, did any of your work teach you anything about what they can do where they're constantly throwing mulch in beds? Just seems like a breeding ground for it.
No, but I've heard kind of horror stories about
Oh.
how quickly these worms cycle through everything, and I mean, just destroy the soil, destroy beds, destroy the plants, and I mean, yeah, there's really just not a good control option right now. The saponins, which were really popular, aren't being produced right now, or at least aren't being marketed in the U.S. anymore.
Hmm.
So that's our biggest control measure taken away in the last, 5 or 6 months. Um, again, the pesticides can be effective, but I hate recommending them because they aren't labeled for earthworm use, and so it's difficult. I razor
Yeah.
how to cut, try
That's,
to mask the
yeah.
problem.
And in the flower beds, I mean, they're picking up the hostas and walking away with them. There's
Yeah.
there's so many of them there.
Hmm.
So listen, Carl, did we get any worm questions while we've been talking? Because I want to get to the clover part now.
Yeah, no worm questions so far. So, I did actually have a question. So we always kind of at least on golf course turf, shorter cut turf, we're worried about the castings, and that's really what's causing the problems. The mower's going over it, it's smearing it. Is there any way we can get the worms to maybe go throw their castings somewhere else? Maybe we don't have to control the worms, but control how they, put their castings up by the surface.
Yeah, that was the idea behind some of this top dressing. Was that okay? The sand is going to be abrasive. Earthworms are soft-bodied. You might alter the moisture and the organic matter in that system. The research is still kind of up in the air on that, but the benefit with sand is that you might be able to make the cast more sandy, so that they aren't smearing the mowers.
Right.
They're a little easier to kind of get within the canopy.
And let me commend that article, Paige's review article again, to everybody, because in there she talks about the casting characteristics that these different species have, some more or less conducive. And I've seen, talking about golf and, on Long Island where you've got sandy lawns, if somebody's coming in and bringing topsoil to grow a lawn, that might, maybe it's good to try to grow the grass on the sand, if worms can be a problem, and you might be installing that there. But, the combination of some irritant, maybe an insecticide or a fungicide that you're targeting, but no one's going to do that in a lawn, right? I really wanted you to come on and say to me what I thought, which is, yeah, good luck with this. I mean, we need so much more research in this area, because worms at a right level in a lawn and landscape can be beneficial in the churning and building and managing of organic matter, right, Paige?
Yeah, they can be. The casts are really high and really concentrated in organic matter and nutrients and all of that, and they're more plant available nutrients in a lot of cases. So they can be beneficial, but yeah, this jumping worm in particular in lawns is
it's a
big
problem.
issue.
Yeah. Okay. So listen, let's transition to clover, and the forecast that I mentioned also forecasts the way we think about broadleaf weed control at this time. Now, Paige, this is part of our discussion, right? When we're talking about clover, is okay, you want to have a flowering lawn. Let's talk about the melding of the traditional lawn with the idea of a flowering or clover lawn like you're talking about. And the thing we recommend generally are these, the model that was developed out of Purdue for timing in the springtime. You wonder about the accuracy of this in a year that's been so delayed and slow in the spring. And for those of you that don't know about our forecast website, you can have a dandelion dashboard, your own, based on a zip code that will give you favorable times for using products that could provide some broadleaf weed control. And so I just wanted to set the context with you, Paige, that, I've been thinking about this low input lawn thing for the 30 years of my career. And these, every once in a while, these obscure papers come out, this one from the Czech Republic, where they looked at, they had a lawn that they just sort of mowed, left the clippings and fertilized it differently for 10 years. This was 10 years of either collecting or mulching mowing, and then no fertilizer, essentially 1 pound or 2 pounds, I would call the home lawn, 1 application, 2 applications a year. And a couple of things are fascinating here in setting up the context, looking at a research study that shows what happens in a lawn. If you look at the legumes that clover would be a part of, the place where you see them really suppressed is where clippings are returned. Right? And that would be an indication of maybe something happening, because I would have thought also that with fertilization, you might see some suppression. But you see the largest expanse of the grass itself, the grass is that self in these lawns where they mulch mode. Now, if you look at the species representation there, just the grass part, right? Let's go back. The 60 to 70% of these lawn types are grasses, and then the other 30 is dispersed between legumes, weeds, and bare ground. And obviously, you see, where you water but you don't fertilize, you've got Kentucky bluegrass, right? You've got Kentucky bluegrass up here, and then the fine leaf fescues and some bentgrass, right? Well, you irrigate and you fertilize a lot, and you get Kentucky bluegrass, perennial rye, and annual bluegrass. And in this case, they note it behaves like a perennial because you're irrigating it and not experiencing the drought stress. And then you go to unirrigated, sort of just mowed, and now you see turf-type tall fescues, hard fescue, and red fescue in the grass mix. Now, I bring this up, Paige, because, everybody imagines a sort of a nice uniform clover lawn like this. And this was what we talked about years and years ago. You look at an old seed catalog from 1895, and they're talking about clover regularly included in the seed mixes. Then you go to Amazon, and Amazon is now selling, or Scotts is selling, a clover lawn. Now, I had a difficult time. I couldn't get what was in this, but what I thought was very interesting, Paige, is they say there's strawberry clover in there. I didn't know this was something you could get. Now, also in the context of this discussion is these flowering lawns, right? This is the Florida lawn that is sold by Pure Turf, Pro Turf, Protein Lawn Seed or something. And you can see here, there's a white clover and then this frigerium. So I thought that was interesting. I thought that was hard to get. And then Eric Watkins in his lab with his graduate students, I'm assuming, and maybe another faculty member, looked at the establishment of Cura clover, Trifolium ambiguum, in these lawns, and they just published this last year. Now, I took this little quote out of there because I actually thought it to be the key part of our discussion, which is, it's one thing to get these things established, right? But essentially, we're talking about managing these areas, right? Not just simply, not just simply planting them, but managing them. Now, here's some of your work that you've been tweeting about. I've been so interested in this, watching this come about. But one of the issues that we face is, sometimes clover doesn't play nice. Now, on athletic fields, it could or couldn't have its issue, but how it becomes patchy long-term. And the questions about managing other plants out of it. So let's start with the general discussion. You're in Utah. I'm thinking this has got to be something about water. So let's start with maybe the way you're approaching, or maybe that's not right. So I threw a whole lot of stuff out there, and we can talk about how you want to unpack it. But let's start with just the simple stuff. What are you doing out there now? What kind of stuff are you looking at?
Yeah, so the biggest issue that I see with a lot of the research is that it does focus primarily on white clover, which is not super drought tolerant. I mean, it'll kind of come and go. But there are other clovers out there, and they have potential. And so I'm looking at white clover kind of as the industry norm. Strawberry clover as well, because it does seem to be a popular one. But I'm also looking at some of these others that have done really well in pasture settings. So crimson clover and rose clover, which is actually used pretty exclusively, from what I can tell, in vineyards in California. Mm-hmm. And so if it's doing all right in California, I figured it'd do all right in Utah.
And those would be characterized by less frequent mowing, right? Once you get into the pasture setting, clover seems to respond in a funky way to mowing, because I have it in my fields here with my pigs. Our fields, we don't fertilize them, and they wind up with a lot of clover. And I've seen clover that, somebody would probably tell me is micro clover, honestly. I just think it's what clover does when you trim it closely like that. Is that your sense of some of this?
Yeah, so I'm mowing mine at about 3 inches, which has been actually pretty okay for most of the clovers. The crimson clover is still a little iffy on it because that's kind of the tallest growing. But actually the rose clover is doing really well under mowing. It very rarely gets up to that 3-inch height. So I actually don't take a lot of tissue off of that one. The white clover obviously gets crazy, and so I pull a lot off there, but it comes back within the next week, and so it's doing fine. Same with the strawberry clover, actually.
So these, one of the things the reason I wanted to talk about this in the lawn and landscape session is because, you wonder if this isn't something maybe we should start rethinking, introducing back into the lawns. I saw that you used that sort of scalping establishment method. Is that to me, I love it personally, opening it up and doing that. So I'm wondering how you like establishing it. And then I want to talk about what you think with regard to sort of the way it evolves and managing it longer term. That will be speculation, I suspect.
Yeah. So last year I started this trial just with bare soil. We seeded the grass and the clover at the same time and just kind of let it all grow up. The clover really took over, like very heavily. It was almost, 70-80% clover in most cases, which isn't ideal. I mean, you still want the grass there to provide some of that, resiliency against traffic or whatever the case may be. So this year we decided to kind of restart the trial. We went in, we scalped, because that seems to be kind of what the research suggests is the easiest and best way to do it. So I kept the same seeding rate. We went in, scalped it all down, and then a couple days later went in and seeded. And it's actually working out really well right now. I think it's a good way to go because it's something that a homeowner can do. You don't have to get, like an aerification system set up. You don't have to go in and try and verticut with all of this. Anyone can scalp the lawn.
That's right. That's right. So many people, it's their preferred way of keeping it.
Yeah. So it's easy.
Right. And now, okay. So part of it is no one's saying that every plant in that lawn's got to be clover. We're looking for these mixed species.
Yes.
And I'm wondering about transitioning from the lawns we have to the lawns maybe that have these clover and even other plants in them. Let's start with the kinds of shifts you think you're going to make. Are you going to fertilize your clover lawns the same way, number one?
So that's something I'm actually looking at with this trial. So half of each of those mixtures, we have plots that are going to be fertilized and plots that are not going to be fertilized. And we're going to see kind of how that affects the mixtures, but also the turf. Because again, we do want to keep that turf there. So if we're fertilizing the turf, is it going to take over the clover? If we're not fertilizing, is the clover going to take over the turf, or vice versa? Some of that research has been done on white clover. There's a lot of research showing that, or at least looking at fertilizer and how it affects clover, white clover, but a lot of that isn't known for some of these other species that have potential. And so that's one aspect that we're looking at with this, is kind of how those mixtures are going to change based on different management practices.
And as we wrap up, that's fast 30 minutes. It's not like clover is going to be the only plant there. You may get dandelion, you may get ground ivy, you may get winter annuals like henbit, you may have crabgrass issues. I know McElroy has published a little bit on herbicide aspects. This is really going to complicate things. There's a little bit of wiggle room in that 2,4-D doesn't necessarily bother clover all the time. I've seen it damage it pretty bad, but it does complicate things. What is your thinking with regard to this, other vegetation, or how people are either going to embrace it or try to manage these other plants?
Yeah, that was, again, another aspect of this research. So I am looking at weed cover as it pertains to these mixtures and what weeds we're getting and how many. And part of the idea behind these mixtures with clover is that you are potentially reducing the number of weeds that you're getting in your lawn because you have more of that competition. You have those broadleaves and those grasses in there that are going to have a little bit more effect on your weeds. And again, yes, it's going to make control difficult. You can't spray much. The 2,4-D can be effective on white clover, or not effective. It can be used on white clover, but again, we don't know about these other species of clover, whether they're resistant to it or not. So yes, you might get some more issues, but my research last year showed that, I mean, obviously we weren't spraying pesticides, but the grass-only plots had tons more weeds, significantly more weeds than these clover plots did.
Yeah.
Or these mixtures.
Yeah, and we have seen that. We've seen clover keep out crabgrass in some ways. So Carl, let's ask, are there any questions about the things we've been yakking about?
Yeah, Dave Chinnery out in Albany is asking about time of sieving. So I don't know, Paige, if you have any preferences or if there's any literature that suggests a certain time to do the clover seeding, the scalp and seed process, maybe.
Yeah, so I seeded, 2 weeks ago, maybe. Clover's it'll come up whenever you seed it for the most part. Here, I seeded last year. We got a late start, so mid-June it was already super hot out, and it came up just fine.
Yeah.
Better than my bluegrass did.
Yeah, I think soil's between 50 and 70.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to be that different or distinctly different from cool season grass establishment.
No.
It seems to.
And it actually came up this year a little bit quicker than, I mean, we were still coming out of dormancy with the bluegrass in my old plots, and the clover was thriving and happy. So
Beautiful.
And it'll survive dormant seeding, so you can seed in the fall as well, which some of these I'll have to do because 2 of the species that we're using are annuals, so there will be some reseeding there. But yeah, any time of the year is really fine, just whenever.
Perfect. Okay, Carl, other questions?
Yeah, that was it. So I think you guys covered a lot of ground with the worms and clover. Paige, I also put a link to your video. I know you guys at Arkansas did a really well-produced video on the top dressing and the worm casting. So if people are interested in that, they can check it out.
Thanks so much for joining us, Paige. Good luck with your graduate work in this crazy time.
Yes, thank you.
Take care of yourself. Appreciate you taking the time.
Have a good day, guys.
Thanks, Paige, and thanks everybody else for joining us. We'll see you in
2 weeks.
2 weeks. Yep, 2 weeks is our next one, and I'll throw the survey again for anybody who
appreciate that.
To
Thanks a lot, Paige. Take care.
Thanks.
This has been a production of Cornell University. On the web at cornell.edu.